Hey guys, good to see everybody. Good to see everybody. Thank you for coming on a Saturday afternoon at 4 p.m. All right, thank you. I know that you will be blessed by what Jason has prepared. He's well studied in the topics that he's going to be presenting us, and so we're getting to hear from his years of experience and from a heart that loves the church and loves young people and how we relate to them. And so I'm very thankful for him. I think I told you that I first found Jason's study and first discovered him through the Radically Christian podcast that Wes McAdam leads. And I'm very thankful for that podcast and have been over the years. And so if you listen to podcasts, if you're searching for one to listen to, I certainly recommend that one. And if you back up, I don't know, probably about 8 or 9 months or so, you'll get to see an interview with Jason. And so very, very thankful for him. And so he sent me a relatively short bio. So let me just read this as an introduction, and then we'll pray, and then we'll give him time. And again, thank you for being here. Jason is the media outreach minister for the Madison Church of Christ in Madison, Alabama. He drove up today about 2.5 hours, he said. He has been in full-time ministry since 2007. In 2017, after 10 years in youth ministry, he transitioned into his current role as media outreach minister. He and his wife, Ellen, live in Harvest, Alabama, with their 4 children. Jason has a BA in youth and family ministry from Faulkner University and an MA in online ministry from Regent University. Again, glad he's here with us today. Everybody stay around. We've got plenty of barbecue to eat around 5. And then we'll come back in here for another session around 6 p.m. I really wanted to encourage you. You have papers in the pews. We're going to use these both today and tomorrow. And so be writing questions or thoughts. These seminars, I've watched a few of them already, and Jason's really good about being open and provoking questions and then entertaining your questions and listening and thinking with you. And so take advantage of that. If you have questions, you may be able to talk about them with Jason today, and you'll especially be able to communicate them tomorrow during our Q&A time. Another way to do it is to just text them to me, okay? If you don't have my cell phone number, just let me know, wave at me, and you can get it. I'll give it to you. But if you have a question, if he says something and you just want to text a question, just text it to my phone number. I'll collect those, and we'll work through those tomorrow as well, okay? Again, thank you. Big deal. Saturday at 4 o'clock, big deal. We will be blessed as a congregation for participating in this, and I'm extremely thankful that you're here. I mean that. Pray with me. God in heaven, Lord, thank you so much for your church. Thank you for your love for us. And Father, our ability and mission to work hand in hand with you, to love and to restore. Father, I'm so thankful for Jesus who has saved us and for the peace that comes from knowing him as our Savior and King. Lord, thank you. And for servants of his like Jason and his good family, Ellen and their boys who work diligently and who's given so much to help and to lead your people, especially in the topic of technology and how it impacts us and how it's used for your kingdom. Lord, I'm just so thankful. And so please bless him with just comfort and peace as he's here with us today. Help him to not feel pressure or to be intimidated by your servants who are here at Old Union, but to just share so openly and freely. And Father, I pray that we can have open minds and hearts, and we can be very thoughtful and even critical of our own practices, all for the purpose of your kingdom, following Jesus and loving others. Again, God, thank you so much, and bless Jason as he's here with us now. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Being written about it, but we know that technology has certainly been impacting us forever, essentially, for as long as we've been around. So I started digging into it, and as a result of that, I was preparing for a class at Madison. It was about 12 weeks long. This turned into this analog faith and digital Babylon. And after that class, got requested a couple of places to come and share some of those ideas. So I've kind of condensed that into 4 or 5 sessions. So what you're getting this weekend is the results of a class, really. But it was a really interesting class. It was a very diverse audience. Our adult classes, we have one classroom in particular we call it the Echo Room. Now it's the artist formerly known as the Echo Room. They put about a bajillion sound panels in it. But it's our biggest classroom space. And in that class we had college students all the way up to folks in their mid-70s. And that was really interesting to hear a conversation about technology and how it's impacting us spiritually from every generation's perspective. So for our purposes this weekend, when you think about technology, I think the logical place to start is going to be, I flipped it, it's green. It's green. It's not green. Is it higher here? No? What about now? How about now? So those of you that grew up with the TV that I grew up with, this is perfect. You had to hold the rabbit ear and the aluminum foil this direction. Yep, that's right. While your siblings said, wait, no, I got it. Right when they got it was when you couldn't see the TV anymore, right? So the TV I had, I was in my room, but it was super dangerous because both of the channels that I could get in there were generally pretty good. Public access TV. I'm going to keep rolling. I'll just talk louder. If you can't hear me, talk too fast, just feel free to raise your hand and say, hey man, slow down. I get that a lot. When it comes to technology, I think a really good place to start is talking about generations. Because there is this phrase that we use oftentimes called the generation gap. And I think, as we'll see here in just a moment, there definitely are some differences between younger generations and older generations. But I also think that that's a tool that Satan uses to divide us. And that is where the church must be learned and wise and exercise discernment and refuse to allow technology to be something that's divisive. To not think, not to listen to each other when it causes us to not hear each other, that's when we're in trouble. Our relationship with technology directly impacts our relationship with members of other generations. And I'm going to show that here in just a few minutes. When we look at the oldest generation, there's still a few folks that are a member of the greatest generation, but generally speaking, the oldest generation among us is referred to as the silent generation. And I know a lot of different people use different windows of time to mark each generation. There is some ambiguity in that, but right now one of the leading scholars in generational studies is Dr. Jean Twenge. A couple of years ago, or about a year and a half ago, she released a book called Generations. And in that book, if you like surveys and stats or just this kind of conversation, it's a wonderful resource. She uses the largest data set that we know of to really look at different trends and different mentality philosophies that have grown up out of different generations over the last 100 years or so. So the generation that she starts with is the silent generation. There we go. The silent generation is born between 1925 and 1945. This is the generation right after the greatest generation. So this generation grew up through the Depression. They started trying to make sense of life through the Depression and World War II, while the greatest generation were in their more adult years during that time. Some interesting stats or data that I think contribute to where we are today, coming in regards to the family. They were civil rights pioneers, and they had a lot of early marriages in life. They married early in life and had a lot of kids. And that's an interesting trend because the amount of kids that, on average, in America, it changes from generation to generation for various reasons. They married earlier in the 1950s than they did in the 1930s. So they were younger than any generation in the 20th century to get married. Nearly half of new brides in the 1950s were teenagers. Think about that for a second. I got married at the ripe old age of 26. My dad, ironically, was also. He's the youngest of 6. His oldest brother got married, I think, when he was like 19 or 20. So there's almost a generational shift just in their sibling distance there. 16 years is a long time. Totally different lives. But when you think about our former minister, we were just talking about him earlier, a friend of mine, he got married. He's one of those that got married at 18. So when I'm a young youth minister at Madison, and he looks at me and says, man, when are you going to get married? I'm like 22, 23. The first response is, I'm trying to get married. I didn't marry my middle school sweetheart like the rest of us in 26, there's a lot of changes that happen in your life. And if you're married during that time and not married during that time, those are completely different experiences. So that's why we're looking here at some of these stats. The post-war baby boom in 1957, some stats that show that. The 1957 birth rate was 3.8 kids per woman. So parents of two-child families were now, that grew up with one sibling, were now parents of multiple kids, 3 and 4 kids. That's a big shift in the home. The divorce rate also shot up in the 60s and 70s. Most divorces between ages 25 and 49. So the silent generation are the ones that actually started the boom, the divorce trend in America. The boomers took it to a whole other level, but it actually traces back, the rise of it starting during the silent generation. There's some contributing factors to the rise of divorce. Individualism was really becoming a big shift in our culture during that time. Technology in the home allowed more women to be in the workforce. More of the home appliances was a big boom, particularly in the 50s. Remarriage was very, very common during this time among this generation. 60% men and 50% of women that were divorced remarried within 5 years. Think of Elizabeth Taylor, who was married, I think, 8 times. Johnny Carson, 4 times. Larry King, he's another 8-time award winner there. Silents were twice as likely as those in the greatest generation to believe that traditional gender roles were not necessarily better. So think about where we are today. We're talking about gender roles in society. We think of that as a very contemporary issue, right? But silents were twice as likely as those in the greatest generation. What's the generation that comes right after the silent generation? The boomers. Boomers, right? So boomers were, a lot of them, and they were loud. So you have this tension between the greatest generation and the silent. They have a lot in common. There's sort of this in-between generation. They were bookended by, we kind of idolized the greatest generation. So there's this ideology of they're perfect almost, right? It's an impossible generation to live up to because of all the things they lived through. And then you have the boomers who were loud, they were anti-establishment. For the Gen Xers, they're between the boomers and millennials, 2 of the largest generations that we've ever seen. Within 2 generations, opinions have completely flipped now, with most greatest generation supporting traditional gender roles and most boomers disagreeing. And the silents, they were in this battle, this tug of war, and they tended to lean towards the boomers. There were a lot of advances in healthcare, which meant people were living longer. There were fewer single elderly women today than there were in 1990. This generation was more educated than generations before them. They were the first generation to have a majority of the group graduate high school. They were very consistent in political power. You have people like Mitch McConnell, Trent Lott, Harry Reid, Nancy Pelosi, Newt Gingrich. They've been in politics for 150 years, seems like. Supreme Court justices like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Sandra Day O'Connor, Stephen Breyer, Anthony Kennedy, and Antonin Scalia. These folks have been a part of American history and a part of the American political scene. Apparently, we should have gotten a technology guy to come and learn how to work a microphone. It's very humbling. If you're with us online, welcome. I just showed my greatest qualification. All right, back to history. They were very conservative compared to other generations, though, in some other, in the political realm of things. They're considered stable and calm, and some of there was a noticeably lower, suicide rate among this generation. And as we get into some of our stats that talk about COVID and just before COVID, we're going to see those trends come to be. So the next generation, of course, is the boomer generation. And this is the part of the session where I give my case that it's not the millennials' fault, it's actually the boomers' fault for everything that's gone wrong, right? A lot of times we do attribute today's challenges and frustrations to whatever the youngest generation is. But I think approaching history this way and not viewing it as Daryl and I were talking earlier, history is not just a linear timeline with a bunch of pictures and dates and names. The way history works is more like waves, and it's like a spider web. Because in technology that was invented in one time period is going to have far-reaching impact to future generations. Boomers were born between 1946 and 1964. Fun fact, we have only had one silent generation president. Do you know who that was? Joe Biden, right? His picture was up there. Yep. If you wanted to cheat, that's fine. I did. You were paying attention. That was good. You actually passed the test. there will only be one silent generation president because, technically speaking, Donald Trump was born in 1946 and Kamala Harris was born in 1964. So they both want to say they're either young or old, whether they're both a part of the same generation. So the boomers' reign continues. In 2021, they were 21% of the U.S. population, so a large group of people. They were very comfortable with drug use. Of course, you think of boomers, I generally think of the 1960s. If you think of the 60s, you think of the hippie movement. Right or wrong, that's sort of that's just their mark in history, right? There was a big rise in self-focus. So choice was at the center of the boomer experience. The whole idea of anti-establishment revolution was I want individual choice. What's interesting is that even within the prime age of the boomers, the coming of age period, in the 60s, there's a very community-oriented slant to anti-establishment. Think of the civil rights movement. You think of even things like the war of Vietnam. It was sort of a community element to it. But the focus shifts in the 1970s to very individual and isolation. That pushes us further into this individualistic society that we live in today. Technology is a big driver in that. There was a big strive for gender equality. They made core values of counterculturalism. That was sort of one of their core values. That was very mainstream during that time. There was also an increase in mental distress and depression. They were very dominant politically as well. As I mentioned, 4 of the last 5 presidents, soon to be 5 out of the last 6 presidents, have been boomers. They had fewer kids and they had more divorce. So some more family statistics here. They were more about breaking traditional rules, particularly sex before marriage. In a nationwide survey, 85% of U.S. adults said that premarital sex was wrong in 1967. In 1967, 85% of U.S. adults said that premarital sex was wrong. In 1979, so we're talking 12 years later, that percentage went from 85% to 37%. That is a drastic shift in opinion and perception of adults. The sexual revolution was a battle between the boomers and the greatest generation, and clearly the boomers won out in that. I like to point out whenever my boomer friends say that it's the millennials' fault for everything, that the very first president that tried to redefine the word is was a boomer. So I'm just saying, just throwing that out there. It's been a part of our, today, again, a contemporary idea that we're trying to change definitions of people or things. What really was challenged in the mainstream, in the public, when Bill Clinton was caught for his indiscretions in the White House. And his response was, it depends on your definition of what the word is. I was a young man in the early 90s, and that was a joke for a long time. But if you look up now and you realize how that mentality resonates into the future, again, it's not a one time, this one thing happened with this one person. It's how does this scale up, and what are the waves of impact? When you have the leader of the free world questioning what the definition of the word is that's nonsensical, right? But you see how that starts to permeate the landscape. You think of one of the most famous boomers of all is Oprah Winfrey. Also one of the most influential. One of the things that she was able to do was she was able to leverage this idea that now we can talk about just about anything. And that's a big element, a big descriptor of the boomer generation, is that the boomers were really willing to talk out in the open about things that previous generations didn't talk about. They talked about sexual things. They talked about political things. They were very out in the open. And so on the one hand, that's really good. Now we can talk about things. On the other hand, now we talk about everything, right? So there's kind of an equal and opposite reaction here. But there is a massive popularity, and she gained massive influence simply by being willing to talk about things. That one of the interesting things that Jean Twenge points out is that the world, particularly in the United States, changed with the evolution of the boomers. When the boomers were children in the 1950s and 60s, the country was very child-focused, particularly with entertainment. Think of TV shows like Leave It to Beaver, Andy Griffith, which actually was kind of radical in its own time as a single father raising his son, right? When they were rebellious teens, the nation was in the midst of social change of the 1960s and all the tumultuous years there towards the end of that decade. When they were young adults, culture in America experienced a fascination with the mystical, and that's the 1970s. That's the only logical reason for the existence of disco, if you ask me. But just a consequence of doing weird things, right? A lot of polyester came out of that decade. They were building their careers in the 1980s and the 1990s, and you look up and you look at our economy and you look at the emphasis of our country was on those same types of things. So it's kind of interesting now that they're in the retirement years, and I realize there are quite a few boomers that are making eye contact at this part in the room. It's interesting just kind of how our economy, how the major decisions of our government and all have really kind of tracked along with the life cycle of the boomers. What's interesting is Twingy notes that there is this database out there called the Google Word Database, and it catalogs all of the words used in literature and books for past decades, for past 100 years or so. And it's really interesting, the word unique and identity surged in use in American books after the 1960s, particularly the word identity. And if you were to ask most people what's the number one word that's used today in just general conversation, I think identity is one of those. It would have to be on that list of probably overused in some cases. But this goes back decades. This goes back now, we're talking 60 years ago. The things that have brought us to where we are today, the events, the philosophies, the people, it's never just in a vacuum, right? Context is really, really important. Most Gen Zers and Gen Alpha, which would be my kids' age, have no clue about these things. You know, when I was growing up in high school, I graduated high school in 2003. We never really got to Vietnam in the 60s. We never got to history that was 40 or 50 years to us. We got to World War II at best. That's a little bit of a shame because there's a lot that happens between 1944 and then 2003 that directly impacted my life that I was never taught. So if you rely exclusively on school, you're going to come up short, right? I've learned more about history as an adult than I ever did in class. And one of those things that I learned is that it's not just this timeline. I memorized the dates and I learned for the test, but I didn't learn the context in which I live. And it's really, really important.
So why was that?
Why was that?
Why did your history lesson growing up stop at the Second World War? What other social influences?
We spent a lot of time on ancient history. We spent a lot of time on the Mayans and the Medes and the some of the Medes and Persians, but a lot of world history. But when we got to American history, there was too much of it, I guess. Spent a lot of time on the Revolutionary War and not a lot of time on the in-between. I had a civics teacher as a junior in high school that she did, but she was teaching civics, so she taught in the context of, the three branches of government, but not necessarily, hey, these wars, these political movements, these social movements. Had a really kooky sociology teacher that maybe worked some of that in there, but I never got to see the box of the puzzle. I was just given a bunch of random pieces, right? And what happens when you have a bunch of random pieces to a puzzle, you don't know what picture you're actually trying to put together. You end up putting pieces together that you think fit, and then eventually years later you flip them over and realize you were actually looking at the cardboard side and don't fit at all. So I think we do that sometimes even in our Bible teaching. Without teaching the whole picture of Scripture and how it all fits in together, we start piecing these things together when they don't really fit. I like analogies, so that may have been more confusing, but it made sense in my head. Yes, ma'am.
What you're pointing out is, and I fully believe that a lot of times we fail to look at the context of what's going on in the world around biblical events.
Exactly.
And how that has influenced the biblical events.
Yeah. So we learn world history, and then we see some of those. We see words like Medes and Chaldeans in the Bible, but we don't ever link the two together, right? We don't show them in the context because we learn school, we have school education, we have Bible school education, and then we have pop culture. And never shall the three meet, right? But you're right that we exist in the overlap. We are here because they all actually overlap. So that's maybe something for us as if you're a teacher to consider, particularly when you're teaching Old Testament. Bring in what the world history books are talking about and show our kids how they work together. Yeah. Great thoughts. The birth control pill was introduced in 1964. And when you think about impactful technology, I would say the light bulb and birth control are pretty close to 1 and 2. The light bulb was introduced in 1870-something. My main man, Thomas Edison, was the best marketer. There were other guys that also had some inventions around that time, but his was the main incandescent light bulb that we have today. He changed life. I read somewhere that the average amount of sleep that an American got pre-light bulb was 11 hours. Today that average is closer to 7. My wife and I have 4 young kids. 7 sounds like the promised land. But however much sleep you get, and I know we have a new dad in here. Where did he go? He's asleep. Sorry, don't wake him up. Let's let him snooze. It's good. It's all good.
I got 9 hours last night.
Well, nobody likes a bragger, okay? All right. I got a 2-year-old that's 6, so now you can leave. All right. Also, roll tide. We got that out of the way. So I know I lost you. I was doing so good. Imagine, no matter how much sleep you get, but imagine if on average you added 4 hours to that every night. How much more patient would we be? How much healthier would we be? You know, all the different things. 4 hours of sleep a night on average. That's remarkable, but that's the light bulb, because now it's daytime, anytime. And there's this part of, I'm not an anti-technology guy. It's actually in my title, media outreach guy. So I'm not anti-technology, but in my mind, there is this part of humanity that is not just geared Godward per se, but it's geared towards seeing ourselves as God-like, as opposed to godly. Think back to the Tower of Babel. Look, see what we have done. Technology can really appeal to that part of our hearts if we're not careful. So the intention of a spiritual-minded person is to leverage technology to further the gospel, to be more effective in spreading the word of God, but also protecting ourselves from the time where it goes from convenient to crossing over to now it's actually forming bad spiritual habits or bad spiritual way of thinking. In the New Testament, over and over again, Paul talks about this contrast of this war of the spirit and the flesh. And the spirit is at war with the flesh. We live in this fleshly body, in this earth, for lack of a better term, realm, right? This world that Satan has rule over, and he is so very clever. And he uses great technology to cause great harm sometimes. We have a lot of diversity in a lot of our churches, age-wise, that he uses to divide us. We think, well, I don't need the young person. I don't need the new gadget. I like the way things were. And the young person thinks, well, the old person, they don't know anything. They don't want to listen. The fact is, the old folks need the young folks to put their phone back in English when it somehow gets to Portuguese. And the young folks desperately need to know how things used to be. Because there's a remarkable similarity between the spiritual struggles that you had if you grew up as a teenager in the 1960s as you have in the 2020s. They're packaged differently, and you face them at a different time earlier in life, and you have a different toolbox, so to speak, a different skill set to be able to navigate that. But the sins, if we believe the words of Solomon, the sins are the same, right? But there's nothing new under the sun. We have to be wise and discerning in identifying what those spiritual challenges and truths are so that we can kind of calibrate the language. Sometimes that's all it is calibrating the language, right? One generation says, that's cool. They don't mean it's cold. They mean it's really neat, right? The next generation uses words like skibbity. No one knows what it means, but they use it, right? Growing up as a kid, you used weird language to your parents and grandparents as well. So it's a matter of us being able to kind of recalibrate, seeing each other for who we really are, not for the people that Satan wants us to see, right? All right, I'll let the defense rest on the boomers' fault. We'll move on to Gen X. Gen X were interesting because they are both analog and digital communicators. These are the folks that are just above me. I've got several friends in this generation that I'm very close with, and we share a lot of the same tendencies, and then it's interesting at times when we kind of part ways on our preferences. They were the first generation on the internet, and they were also the last generation to have a mostly analog childhood. Think about this. They were the last generation to go through high school without the internet. And if you have a teenager or you're around teenagers, going through high school with the internet is a completely different experience. My daughter somehow still has a really heavy book bag, but they don't have textbooks. She's in 4th grade. We had textbooks all the time, every grade, right? Everything moved online. When I was in high school, still went to the library, but we were learning to go to the library to then log on the library computer into the online database to pull our research from. And that's only increased since then. They were the last one to use rotary phones, which I think is a great tragedy. The YouTube, you think about some of the platforms that were started by Gen Xers. YouTube is one of them. They were started by 3 Gen Xers. They were the first web browser, Netscape, back in the day was called Mosaic, was written by a Gen Xer in 1993. eBay, PayPal, MySpace, Twitter, Uber, Napster, all of these companies were started by Gen Xers. So they were the first ones to really create the landscape and the storefronts of the internet. The millennials were the first ones to be the first consumers of the internet. And there's a big difference in those two. They worked at startups. They built file sharing software. They were a big TV generation. And just the idea of watching Saturday morning cartoons, you had a shared experience in every home. So when you got to school on Monday, everybody watched the same shows. Well, it's very different now, right? There's a whole host of different shows on different platforms that we have full access to. There was one I think is very interesting observation that Jean Twenge pointed out. She said, you think about Scooby-Doo. It was created by boomers and geared towards Gen Xers, but Scooby-Doo Shaggy wore the same clothes all the time. He seemed to always have the munchies and kept seeing ghosts. So she suggested maybe a little bit of recreational drug use in the creation of that TV show. I thought maybe so. But you think about Gen X, they grew up on TV shows like The Brady Bunch now, which is a very blended family. They learn the facts of life by watching The Facts of Life. Divorce rates continued to soar. People like Dr. Huxtable became surrogate father figures for Gen X. They were definitely children of divorce. There were nearly 3 times as many children in 1980 that were living with a divorced mom or dad than had been in 1960. So in 20 years, the number of children living with a divorced parent went up 3x. Divorced families grew to become a normal thing. There was also the rise and fall of the latchkey kid. Do you remember that phrase? Latchkey kids were kids that got home from school and went straight home, but their parents weren't there. The parents weren't there generally because both parents were now in the workforce. Remember we talked about those appliances, home appliances of the 50s that kind of paved the way for the women's movement, which created more opportunities to join the workforce, which meant fewer families had a mom or one parent home all the time. So kids come home from school. You don't get off work until 5. You get out of school around 3 or 3:30. So you're home for 2 or 3 hours by yourself. There's a lot of independence that comes from that. There's potentially some trouble, but they were kind of neglected and left to their own devices. Organized after-school programs weren't a thing until the 1990s. This is the way society works. We don't put up guardrails until we have a certain number of cars go off the edge of the cliff and we go, hey, maybe we should do something about that. We don't put up a stop sign or put up the traffic light until they put that wire out there and a certain number of cars go by and we realize, hey, there's a lot of traffic. We should adjust to that. And so the same thing happens when you scale it up, when you start looking at demographics in different generations. They share an experience until legislation is passed or something happens to change that experience. We didn't know to have after-school care until the 1990s, really, until we realized that there was a growing sense of danger outside. And that's another big factor. Outside became more dangerous, so kids came inside. About the same time, the internet started coming into homes. So they went outside, now on their devices, into this digital landscape. There was a shorter childhood that was occurring during Gen X. Gen X married later than any generation in American history. The boomers married, on average, for women at the age of 20 and men age 23. Gen X got married on average for women 25 and 27, respectively. So 5-year gap from boomers to Gen X in the women's age and a 4-year gap for the men. Today, the median average age for women to first get married has risen to 28 years old in 2023, and for men, it's now 30 years. So that trend is continuing on the older trajectory. There's a lower age for their first sexual experience and a higher age for the first marriage. So they're more active earlier, getting married later. They're having children. Having children was no longer tied to marriage. How is that the case? Well, we go back to 1964 when the birth control pill was introduced. And that continues to develop over the next 15 to 20 years. And now the landscape that they're born into is that there's now a disconnect between marriage and love and sex. They don't have to be tied together anymore, right? So the overall mentality and perception of these things have been changing very subtly, but very, very profoundly. Having children, again, was no longer tied to marriage. Living together became more acceptable. Think about TV shows like Friends. All of these folks living together and sometimes sleeping together and having these relationships coming and going with different people. It was no longer tied to a family unit. This is a key generational shift during this time. Only 11% of women ages 19 to 44, that's the boomers in silence, had lived with an unmarried partner before their first marriage. Only 11%. For Gen X and millennials, by the time frame of 2010 to 2013, over 69% had lived with an unmarried partner before. Divorce rates fell after the 1980s, but that wasn't necessarily that marriages improved. It just meant that people married later. That generally means they stayed together a little bit longer. College-educated couples who married in the mid-1990s were 27% less likely to divorce in the first 10 years than those marrying in the 1970s. We see an increase in education among younger generations, and it also impacted families. They were considered high on self-esteem and focused on self during this time. They had very high self-esteem. The use of the word self-esteem skyrocketed from 1970 to 1995. Boomers discovered self in the context of groups. You think of the protest of the 60s, and again, the community element of that. But if you go through the 70s and particularly into the 80s and 90s, becoming more individualistic. They had very materialistic lifestyles. TV shows like Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous were kind of precursors to what we have today with online influencers. Portraying this lifestyle of just extravagance and caviar dreams. They were very materialistic. There was a growing divide between the rich and the poor. And so you see a lot of legislation and innovation, particularly in the 80s and 90s, that are really directly impacting families. During the Gen X generation, we have the rise of the personal computer as being one of the most influential technological advances. Now on to my people, the millennials, and they were born between 1980 and 1994. They are described as relentlessly self-confident. They lived through things like 9/11, the housing bubble, and the dot-com boom. After 2000, the first singular pronouns began to take off in literature, and a decrease in collective pronouns began to be seen. Students spent less time doing homework. So there's this rise in self-confidence, but the grades drop. The grades continued to go up, but study time dropped. So what happens when your grades continue to be great, but you spend less time studying? It's not because they're more intelligent. By millennial adolescence, there is evidence of this boosting and empty self-esteem. So we see particularly in the 80s and 90s, a self-esteem emphasis without necessarily having difficult things and resilience to build it. Right? So a lot like the housing bubble, the self-confidence bubble was also rising among this generation. This is one excerpt from Twingee's book. She said, as individualism promoted self-focus and unrealistically positive self-views during the 90s and much of the 2000s, college students' narcissism steadily rose. And then as the economic bubble burst, so did the bubble of narcissism. They were not prepared to handle the life that they now were living in, because the life of the 90s was a great economic time. There was a lot of excess, but living on excess without experiencing the struggle to get to excess does not usually give you the resilience to navigate difficult times. They were considered digital natives. They were a generation that came of age as the internet was advancing. Think of analog methods of entertainment and music gave way to streaming. Think of CDs, that little span of time when we had the mini disc, whoever had those. In 2004, there was a significant introduction called the Facebook.com that came about. And from that point on, college stupidity lived forever online for people to watch and laugh at. They were decentralized as a generation. They were without leaders and focused more on words and ideas rather than single concrete goals. Think of the movements like Occupy Wall Street. They were highly educated. They were the very first generation in which more than 1 out of 3 had a 4-year degree by their late 20s. Previous generations we considered highly educated because the majority of their generation graduated high school. And now we're at the point where 33% had a 4-year degree by their late 20s. But part of the challenge was once they graduated with those degrees, the job market they assumed was there was changing and was no longer what they were told at the beginning of that college venture. They're actually high earners by comparison. I know a lot of us millennials say that we're not bringing in the money, but households headed by millennials actually made more than silent boomers and Gen Xers when you correct for inflation. And I have to say there's not as much here on Gen Z. I know what I have on this slide seems very, very depressing, but it's mostly because all the stats we have right now talk about their depression. And so when you look at Gen Z, they were born between 95 and 2012, and they were 23% of the U.S. population in 2020. That's a huge number of people. They have great influence. There's a big emphasis on gender fluidity. There's a rise in the LGBTQ community. Pronouns have become front and center of public conversation. They are very racially conscious, dissatisfied, depressed, pessimistic, and they have increased online communication and political polarization. The stats we have right now on Gen Z are very eye-opening. There are some really encouraging trends. There's a lot of folks that I know that are part of Gen Z that are looking to use smartphones because we're seeing more and more of the link And this is the meat of this point we'll get into tomorrow during worship, some of the analog consequences to the digital choices that we've made. But if you're looking for a good read, Jonathan Haidt has a book called The Anxious Generation, where he lays out a really compelling argument and case for how technology is greatly to blame for the current condition of Gen Z and younger. There's a huge rise in anxiety, depression, and suicide ideation, the dark triad, as they refer to in the world of counseling. And a lot of this is because, not specifically of technology, but because of all of the events we've talked about that led us to where we are. If we're more individualistic as a child today, as a 7-year-old, than you were as a child, as a 7-year-old was decades ago, and you're given technology that now gives you a connection to the outside world. When I was a kid, I think it was at a flea market or something, I bought an old radio scanner, which I thought was just a really massive walkie-talkie, until one night, I hope they couldn't hear me, but I heard a lot of truckers and learned a whole new vocabulary of things. Very eye-opening. I don't think my parents ever knew that I got it to work. But you were kind of opened up to a whole other way of life that you didn't know existed. Well, today, kids don't have just a radio scanner to hear, have 5 or 6 truck drivers as they drive by in your radius. They're connected to the entire globe. And the way I try to tell parents on this is, how old does your kid need to be before you feel comfortable dropping them off in the middle of downtown New York City or Beijing, or you name a large metropolitan city, and just tell them, hey, be home for dinner and also be healthy and be good, be fine. That's not how it works. Something shifted between the late 90s and the early 2000s in particular. Do you remember, I remember as a kid hearing on TV, it's 10 o'clock, do you know where your children are? That wasn't a part of any program, that was just regularly scheduled at 10 o'clock, right? Do you remember Unsolved Mysteries? America's Most Wanted. These became, Ben 10 Canine Cop, just because he never gets mentioned. But as a kid growing up, there was a lot of fear about being outside and the dark. And it wasn't just Are You Afraid of the Dark TV show. It was also these other things that my parents felt. Well, you can't ride your bike outside anymore. You need to come inside. That trend has some consequence. And once we came inside, we then told children, here you go, you can use this because it occupies your time. And I've got 4 kids. Sometimes you just need them occupied by something other than you. I get it. I understand that. But what we've seen now is over the course of a generation, there's been some catastrophic consequences to those choices. And again, technology is right at the center of that. Were things as dangerous outside as we thought? Statistically speaking, no. We're about as safe as we've ever been. Our life expectancy continues to increase because of health and other, medical and other advances. So some of this is this idea that someone yelled the sky is falling, and so we all just assumed it was. The other side is there are some real dangers out there. But kids today don't necessarily reason the same way they did a couple of generations ago. Gen Alpha, we don't know yet. They're young kids. We don't have data. All of these points and these tendencies are taken from data. So with the time we have left, I want to highlight 4 major revolutions, or particularly 2 of them, of the 60s and 70s that I think contributed to where we are today the most. And these are introduced by Dr. Jeffrey Jensen. This was, I think, 10 or 15 years ago, he started promoting this idea of these revolutions and tying them into where we are today. The first one is the tech revolution. Think about this stat. Manufacturing today is 6 times the amount it was in the 1950s, but it uses half of the amount of people. And it will continue to use fewer and fewer people. I mean, the technology that Amazon is implementing is remarkable. We've got an Amazon place near where I live now, and the way they use robots and all these other different types of technology is really kind of cool, but it's also changing the manufacturing landscape. We move from, or have been moving from, a manufacturing economy to a knowledge economy. Another consequence of that is extended education. To prepare for a knowledge or a tech-driven economy, you need more education. More people get more education for longer, which pushes family later in life. If you have to get a 4-year degree, used to you could have a high school degree for a certain job. Well, now you need a 4-year degree. And the 4-year degree, now you need a master's. So you're in school for 6, 7, 8 years. Well, you don't want to get married because you want to have a job before you get married. And you don't have kids before you get married. So that whole timetable, again, at scale, has been pushed back. It takes longer to prepare for a knowledge economy than it did a manufacturing economy. So a lot of things change and shift with technology. We mentioned the birth control pill in 1964. It broke the link between sexuality, reproduction, and marriage. Most people today begin being sexually active 10 years or more before marriage. There's a longer period where kids are making and breaking relationships. They're given access to adult content years before they have the actual hardware in their brains to understand it and to know what's going on. What does a generation of work smarter, not harder look like? I heard that phrase a lot growing up. Well, at some point, when we teach a generation to work smarter, not harder, and they grow up in a digital age where now they can automate almost everything, and AI has only taken that to a whole nother level, at some point, that generation no longer knows how to work hard the way previous generations did. I live in a town where there are a lot of people that I think would pay a lot of money to have their yard cut. We have a lot of teenagers. We've had one in the last 7 years that I know of that has cut grass. That's a lost art, right? First of all, it's really easy to cut grass today. Everything's self-propelled. But man, they just don't think about it. It's not an option because there's a lot of other extracurriculars that take their time. There's a lot of other things that occupy their time. So the experience I had growing up, I cut grass for almost 10 years, starting in middle school. Well, starting from the time I could push the lawnmower, but I got paid for it starting later in middle school and high school. Did it all the way through college. It was great. Very different experience than what they had growing up. The reason we start here, though, is spiritual. And I promise you, all of our other sessions will come with more Bible. This sort of sets the landscape, though. And I think it's important for us to look at some of these trends and some of these stats because we just kind of look at today and we see it in a vacuum, but today does not exist in a vacuum. No age ever really has. In 1 Corinthians chapter 12, in verse 12, it says, "For just as the body is one and has many members, and all the members of the body, though many, are one body, so it is with Christ." This is the core of why we start talking about technology by talking about the past. Because technology is not exclusively modern technology. And most likely, the experience you had in your teenage, early adolescent years with technology is probably where you really have the most, that's how you now view future generations and their technology. So if you're content with the technology you had, then everything else is unnecessary, right? But if you saw technology as something that was created creativity and incited creativity in your mind and wonder, then you're probably more accepting of new technologies. It doesn't matter. Technology is going to continue to happen. We cannot stop innovation. Congress is trying to do that with AI. It's just, I don't think it's going to happen. It's a good form, man. You got it. But I don't think that's the point. The point is not to try to stop innovation. The point is for us to understand that technology, as it continues, how can we use this new tool in a way that's positive for the church? And how can we protect ourselves from the negative? Because the fact is we need each other. For the body, verse 14, does not consist of one member, but of many. If the foot should say, "Because I am not a hand, I do not belong to the body," that would not make it any less a part of the body. And if the ear should say, "Because I am not an eye, I do not belong to the body," that would not make it any less a part of the body. If the whole body were an eye, where would be the sense of hearing? If the whole body were an ear, where would be the sense of smell? But as it is, in God's wisdom, He arranged the members in the body, each one of them as He chose. If all were a single member, where would the body be? As it is, there are many parts, yet one body. We don't exist individually in the church. We exist as a part of the body. And as individuals, we are important to that body. Listen to verse 21. "The eye cannot say to the hand, 'I have no need of you,' nor again the head to the feet." Or if we could repurpose this just for this context, the millennial cannot say to the boomer, "I have no need of you." The silent cannot then say to the Gen Xer that I have no need of you. On the contrary, verse 22, the parts of the body that seem to be the weaker ones are indispensable, and on those parts of the body that we think less honorable, we bestow greater honor, and on our unpresentable parts, we treat with greater modesty. Ultimately, we need each other. And we cannot allow age and life experience to divide us. We have to use age and life experience to find a way to connect us and to unite us, to mentor the next generation. I cannot teach my kid about every single app that gets developed and introduced in their lifetime. It's a fruitless pursuit. I won't be able to keep up. My role, I believe, as a parent is to teach them how to think spiritually about the technology that they choose to incorporate in their life. And that begins with my habits and my approach and how I think and talk about technology. The fact that I can let Siri or I can let Alexa do everything is great until I realize that it's actually making me lazy, until I realize it's actually doing some bad things, until I realize there's actually some security issues there as well. If I just adopt blindly the newest technology, that's dangerous. If I put my head in the sand and I refuse to acknowledge any new technology, that's also dangerous. When we as the church refuse to acknowledge new technology, then we do alienate the next generation that's excited about it. I was excited about CDs. My dad liked records. We found a compromise. 8-track was there. We found what we really loved. We both loved music. And that's how we have to look at this, is the tool or the mode of which we access the music, that was inconsequential. Ironically enough, I love records now too. And he almost knows how to use a CD player, which now we're doing streaming. The technology is going to change. I love my kids. When I'm not there with them and I call them on the phone or we can do FaceTime, I love that. But the phone is not what I love. The phone is a tool. It's a device. Somewhere along the way where we've gone wrong, particularly with this current emerging generation, the teenagers and younger, they're starting to fall in love with the technology. They're cultivating relationships with devices. Devices are tools to steward. And we have to make sure that we very articulately, very clearly, and very loudly, and over again, drive that point home. Because we're entering into an era in technology where the line between real and not real is getting blurrier and blurrier and blurrier. And as robots, and I know it sounds weird, cyborgs and AI technology, it's already here. And we think 1 or 2 generations ahead, if we do not teach them how to think spiritually about everything. That's the whole point, is I think we've kind of, at times at least I learned growing up, this is church stuff and this is school stuff and this is baseball stuff. Everything was compartmentalized, but that's not at all what the Bible teaches. We have died to ourselves, to our passions, even to our own, what we thought the future was going to be. We've died to those things. We are alive only in Christ now. We live for His goals, for His version of the future, right? Paul says in Galatians that I have been crucified with Christ. It's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. The life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, regardless of the technology, regardless of the age. The role of the church in the digital age is the same as the church in the first century age, to glorify God, to grow His kingdom. We just have a different way of amplifying the gospel. That's what technology does. Secondly, there's another verse here as well. The reason we start here is because we all fall short. Romans 3:23, we've all sinned and fall short of the glory of God. We are all also being shaped by technology in different ways. We all need each other. My grandmother-in-law, we put an Alexa in her apartment. My kids, I don't have grandkids. My children, when they go to their grandparents' house, play with Alexa up in the playroom and do a bunch of silly dance songs and stuff. Well, their grandmother, great-grandmother, when she fell, used Alexa to call her son. Same device, one used for pure entertainment and one used to leverage it to save her life, essentially. You see how it's really difficult sometimes then to discern when it's a good thing and a bad thing? That's the way Satan works. If he really was dressed up in a red suit with the little horns and the tail and the pitchfork, that'd be fantastic. That's really easy to spot in an elevator. All right, I'll wait, thanks. I'm actually going up now. How about that? Yep. But that's not the way it works. He's very clever, very, very clever. If you have not already, I think a survey was sent out to you. Did you guys send an email link? Okay, this is the same link. So if you've already filled out that survey, don't feel like you got to do it again. But if you have not, please use this QR code and take this survey. I'm going to share some of the results tomorrow. We're going to be talking about sexuality, and particularly, this will be in our adult class Sunday morning at 9 o'clock. Talk about some of the trends in our conversations and who is having the conversations, who is not having the conversations, and then scaling back out to the different generations and how that has kind of led to where we are in the church today, particularly as well as abroad. So some really interesting trends that I've noticed in that. I've done this survey now at several different churches, and I have a little over 600 participants, so it's getting close to being like a real survey as far as stat-wise. So I'm anxious to share some of that with you. Thank you for your participation in that. Any questions or comments? I know this is a lot, and that's part of the downside of doing a a quick session, but it's a bunch to consider. To me, these are really interesting things to look at because they paint a different picture than maybe what we have in our mind when we just think of the term technology. So, anybody else with anything to add before we close with a prayer?
Fascinating run for the generations.
That-
Fascinating
it is.
run for the generations.
It's kind of eye-opening, isn't it? Yeah. I recommend if you're a reader or if you're not a reader. I was not a stat guy or a reader, and I was captivated by Gene Twiggy's book because of those kinds of things. It's like, wow, there's another book that I would recommend. I have a QR code that we'll do tomorrow that gives a suggested reading list of all the research. It's called Strange New World by Carl Trueman, and he does basically a 100-year survey on philosophies and teachings about that have come about over the last 100 years. There's a fella in there by the name of Reich. I always forget his first name, but he blended two philosophies. The philosophies of Karl Marx, which said that the government is the final ultimate authority, and Sigmund Freud, who said basically sexuality is the end-all be-all authority. And what Reich, what he said in there was basically the government should have the right, when the government has the right to basically assign sexuality and to describe sexuality and to legislate sexuality, now the government has become truly the end-all be-all authority, kind of blending those two together. And if there's anything that accurately describes the last 15 years of legislation in our country, it's that topic. Well, he was proposing these thoughts in 1923, like exactly 100 years ago. So there truly is nothing new under the sun. And there can't be anything new if we believe that the Bible, which is right here, if we believe that this is inspired, right? If we believe that it was relevant in the first century as much as it is today, then we have to believe that these things have been around for a while. So we also can't be surprised when the world shows up as the world, right? We can't be surprised by that. That's what we've been told. I think the jarring part is that sometimes worldly thinking creeps into our thinking as spiritually minded people, and that's what's jarring and disappointing and devastating. Because we have not been as alert maybe as we should have. So, any other thoughts or questions? All right, we'll close with a prayer and then maybe some instructions before we go eat. Father, we thank you so very much for the opportunity to gather in your name tonight and this weekend. We thank you for allowing us this place. Thank you for the food that you have blessed us with. And thank you so very much for every person here and even for those that are not able to make it. Help us to make sure that these conversations are not limited in their value, that we take what we talk about and what we study tonight and this weekend, and it goes beyond just these conversations. Help us to change our living so that it reflects your word and our convictions in you. We thank you so very much for Christ. We thank you for the presence of the church through every generation since it began. We love you and we thank you. In Christ's name, amen.